School choice is a device to advance an agenda of privatization where what was public becomes private. That does not work for education. It doesn't work for kids.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
We got a comment on a video last week that we did about privatization of public schools, which we have been very vocally and unashamedly against the privatization of public schools. We make no bones about that. We're very clear about that. We are against that. And the privatization of public schools goes by another name, school choice. And so we made a video about that, or we did a segment on the show and we cut it up and put it out there. And we got a question from a Tom asking if there is ever a place for quote unquote school choice. Is there ever a place for school choice? And so I told him that I'd ask you, Adam, about this because I think he asked it in good faith.
Sure.
It seemed to me, and so I told him that I would ask you, Adam, what you thought about it, because my instinct is to be opposed to any privatization, but that I can conceive of a use case for a publicly, owned and operated charter school meant to be an experimental testing ground for interesting pedagogical, new pedagogical methods for students. And, I could conceive of a use case for that. And so, while I would definitely be, tend to be against any forms of privatization or giving public schools into private hands in any, in any way, I can conceive of a way that you could get me on board with one particular project. But I've not spent most of my activist work, most of my union work in the education field. So I wanted to see what you thought, Adam, and I told him I would. So Adam, what do you think? Is there ever a case for quote unquote school choice?
I think for school choice as a shorthand for a right-wing program of privatization, no. I think school choice a little bit more broadly defined. There very well can be places for that, and I'll give you an example. Some school districts allow choice within their district. For example, in a city or a county district, you may normally have to live in a certain part of town or part of the county, and you're zoned for that particular school, right? It's a neighborhood school setup. Some districts allow choice within their school system, so perhaps you're more interested in the school on the other side of town. And this may be relevant if the schools themselves have unique programs, for example. Athens City Schools is an example where each elementary school has kind of a different theme and a different little twist on things, right? You may have a STEM-based school and then one that's a little bit more along the lines of the arts. So I can see some room for that. Obviously, that's not what folks typically are meaning by school choice. To your point about charter schools in theory, as they were originally theorized, essentially follow on that model, right? They were thought of as a means to experiment and to innovate, to have controlled settings, more or less, for these innovations and experiments, particularly targeting certain populations that were not being well served. So the classic example I remember from like the origins of charter schools, which includes from AFT, right? I mean, union folks were thinking about these things. The idea would be like a public charter school that serves high-risk youth who are at risk of dropping out. And maybe at this charter school, they have some flexibility on their scheduling Maybe they're not locked into an 8 to 3 schedule with 7 periods a day at 52 minutes, right? You know, maybe there are things that they need to do to accommodate students, whether it's curriculum or logistics or structure of scheduling or however that may be. I can see a place for that. And there are charter schools that exist in the United States that are public in terms of they're still publicly funded and theoretically publicly owned. And that aren't that bad, right? They more or less do what they're supposed to do, and kids are benefiting. I would say that's certainly not all of them. I don't even think that's the majority of them by any means. But there are some decent charter schools out there, and that kind of stuck to that mission of experimentation, innovation, maybe targeting certain types of students or targeting certain types of curriculum, for example. I'm okay with some degree of that because I think our public schools are very rigid in a lot of ways. However, that is very different from a conversation about how can you reduce funding to public schools, which is the end result of these schemes for vouchers and charters, education savings accounts. There's various names. The Alabama Accountability Act has scholarships, for example. All of these are different means that have the end result of reducing funding to public schools, and therefore reducing resources available to the students and staff inside the public schools. And we've talked a little bit in the past how often you will siphon off not just the funding, but some of the students and families. And so the students left in the public schools are often the more challenging ones, right? The private schools are less prone to accept students with disabilities or students who don't speak English as a first language, students who have behavioral challenges. You know, private schools are not inclined to accept those students, and they're private. They don't have to, unlike the public school. So, and I know of course, they can't violate federal law in terms of discrimination, but we all know there's what's on paper and then there's reality. There's plenty of ways to discriminate without necessarily giving your victim a clear EEOC case. And so, all that to say, school choice is a rhetorical device that is used to advance an agenda of privatization where what was public becomes private. And that does not work for education. It doesn't work for kids. It never has, and I don't think it ever will. And I think there's plenty of research to show that is just the fact of the matter, that these school choice schemes may serve some families and some students in some cases. I'm sure we can find them. But they're the exceptions, not the rule. And for me, I don't think you sacrifice the few. I don't think you sacrifice the many for the few. And just because a handful of families may have their needs better served under some of these programs doesn't justify everyone else being worse off as a result. And that's what's so unacceptable about it, because ultimately they point to some of the, in some cases exaggerated, in some cases real flaws or issues within the public school system as it currently exists, and their proposals all make it worse. They all cut the funding. They all reinforce some of the issues that are in place already. And so that's how I feel about it. I mean, so if you tell me you can find a charter school in Timbuktu somewhere and they're doing a good job and, you know, it's not corrupt and the kids are learning, I'm not going to argue with you. That could be very well the case. There are some charter schools out there. They're doing a pretty good job. But by and large, it's not about helping kids. It's about money. Public education is one of the last remaining pieces of our welfare state in this country, and therefore it takes up a disproportionate amount of our budgets. I mean, if you look at the state of Alabama, we have an entirely separate budget just for education, and it's in the billions of dollars. And when capital sees those kind of dollar amounts, they see opportunities. They want that money, that public money, in their private pockets.
Yep.
So there's the economic aspect to it, and then there's the, more social and cultural aspects to it. That segregation is absolutely a big component of this, both racial and otherwise. Segregation for religious reasons, segregation for political reasons, issues of gender and sexuality and ability, and all those come into play. It's not about helping kids. It's not about helping teachers. It's not about helping the communities in which those teachers and students live. It's about segregation. It's about money. And there were a couple of things about education that y'all mentioned in the chat.
Yeah.
That I wanted to also respond to, because smaller class sizes absolutely are a proven benefit, and that's why so many teachers unions fight so hard for those year after year, because of the way it impacts working conditions, the way it impacts learning conditions, right? That's one of those most clear examples of where the teacher and the student have real common ground there, because I can tell you a class size of 15 versus a class size of 30 is night and day in terms of the workload on the staff member and in terms of the learning opportunities inside the classroom. It just makes a huge difference. And so definitely agree with that. Christine mentioned a third of us can hardly read, and there's some significant problems with literacy in this country. Absolutely. And I don't think that, and I don't think Christine is implying this either, that's rationale to attack the public school system. I think it just shows us what work needs to be done. And in terms of the KIPP schools, that's one of the most well-known chains of charter schools. That's something else that's pretty creepy about these there's chains. We had Terry Michael on a couple months ago talking a little bit about conversion charter schools that are in place in Alabama, at least are legal in Alabama, where conceivably a charter school chain could come in and take over a part of your school, like a part of your building that's not being used. It's pretty wild. So, the much easier way, the much more simple way, is to fund an appropriate free public education for every kid and do what's right by them. Talk to the educators, who are the experts, ask them what they need, and get it for them. Small class sizes, let them shape the curriculum, let them shape what's being taught. It's not rocket science. Most of this stuff has been pretty well documented for decades, like the links between poverty and test scores, for example. That's not new. We've known about that for a very long time. So when we hear like Alabama's Governor Kay Ivey say that Alabama's test scores are now going to move up into the top 30 before the end of her term, she says. Right? How are you going to do that if you're not going to address the socioeconomic factors that play into those scores? Alabama ranks at or near the bottom in test scores in our schools because Alabama ranks at or near the bottom in every metric of quality of life.
Yeah.
Right? It's not, you can't just separate it out. And that's also where AEA and a lot of the education community is failing as well, because you have to have a holistic approach because there are holistic results. I know it's inconvenient to talk about how race and poverty and corporate subsidies and how these things impact schools. It's much easier to try to separate those conversations and silo it off, but it's not real. You're not addressing real life if you're not addressing that. Yeah. So Kay Ivey, please explain to me, how are you going to get our test scores into the top 30 while maintaining the status quo in every other aspect of our life?
Yeah. William in the chat says, I don't like the lottery system for students to attend
Right.
charter schools.
Me
That seems
either.
like a neoliberal way of admitting children so that they could get a quality education. Indeed, Christine
It is,
also
and it's also
says-
like an admission, right? We're basically admitting, okay, this is a
gonna be-
better education, but not everyone's going to get it.
Sydney Vogel in the chat says, outlaw private schools and watch public school funding skyrocket when rich kids have to go there. Not a bad idea.
I believe that's how it is in Finland, actually.
It is, yes. Free American 2020 says private schools should be required to take the same standardized test that public education takes. And that is absolutely the case at minimum. You know, like if we can't, you know, that's actually one of the reasons, one of the things that people put forward as an idea that, oh, we should have more private schools or school choice or whatever, because they want less government oversight. And it's absurd that we should not have oversight over where our children are being taught. That's bonkers.
Right.
Or that
They want money for it, but they don't want the oversight that
Right,
should
of
normally
course,
come
of
with
course.
those funds.
He also says, how do we well, I mean, I really don't know. I guess, you know, I don't know. I don't know the gender of Free American 2020. But private schools do not want poor minority English as a second language, special ed, discipline challenges. We mentioned that. That's absolutely the case.
And,
He says
and there's
that,
systemic exclusion of those kinds of students in state after state after state.
how do we know children aren't leaving a failing public school and going to a failing private school? And that's actually something that's under discussed is the degree to which, you know, private and charter schools actually don't help as much as they're advertised.
Right.
And we've talked about that
Yeah.
before. Sydney Vogel in the chat says in 2040, there won't be schools anymore, just Uber teach. Oh, God.
It seems to be the trend, right?
That's what they want. Yeah, for sure. Luckily, teachers' unions, Sydney says, are strong and generally well supported by parents and voters, although Free American counters that AEA is a dirty word in Alabama, and that is the case. So, you know, I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah.
But appreciate the conversation about education in the comments.
Absolutely.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.